In November of 1927, the rivers of central Vermont broke their banks and tore the hill country apart. And when the floodwater finally drained back, the people living out there started pulling things out of the mud.
Not debris, not drowned livestock, bodies. Bodies that didn't match anything that has ever lived on this planet.
And the witnesses couldn't even agree on how to describe them, because nothing in human anatomy gave them the words for it. This wasn't some fevered swamp legend either. It was a real, documented disaster in a quiet farming county. And the descriptions kept coming back identical from people who had never met.
Something had been living up in those hills, and the flood had just dragged it out into the open.
This is The Whisperer in Darkness, the story of a skeptic who spent months trying to explain all of it away, and a man alone in a farmhouse who got close enough to learn the truth. Too close.
And underneath the whole thing is one question the ending will not let you walk away from. How much of your own humanity would you trade for the answers to the universe? Because somebody in the story makes exactly that trade.
And it does not go the way he thinks. It began with the flood. Specifically, the historic 1927 Vermont floods. Winooski, the West, and the Passumpsic rivers all swelled and overflowed, which utterly devastated the rural region.
Right, just a massive natural disaster.
But amidst the tragic, everyday debris of a catastrophic flood, the backwoods locals started reporting other things floating in the swollen rivers that completely defied biology.
Witnesses described organic shapes that were entirely alien to the region and, frankly, alien to the planet.
Let me just read some of these anatomical descriptions because my mind struggles to even assemble them into a cohesive creature. We're talking about pinkish bodies, roughly 5 feet long.
5 feet, just picture that floating by.
Right.
Yeah.
And they are crustaceous, meaning they have a hard, crab-like exoskeleton, but they also feature vast dorsal fins or membranous wings.
Which makes no evolutionary sense.
And then there's the head, which isn't a head in any mammalian sense.
Yeah, the head is where it gets truly bizarre.
It's a convoluted ellipsoid, basically a fleshy textured oval, completely covered in a multitude of very short antennae. No eyes, no mouth, just a sensory cluster. And it's exactly that kind of anatomy, something with no earthly rule book to explain it. That's why the protagonist of these sources, a folklore academic named Albert Wilmarth, initially tries so desperately to brush the sightings off.
He insists these locals are just seeing conventional flood debris and letting their imaginations run wild. But the sheer uniformity of the reports makes his skepticism impossible to maintain.
The alien presence has actively bled into the mundane world.
Right. The rural Vermont hills, a place we typically associate with, like pastoral peace, are suddenly compromised. The horror is tangible, physical, and actively decaying in the local watershed.
So if you have impossible creatures washing up in rivers, it means they're leaving footprints in the mud. And human nature dictates that eventually someone is going to try and track them.
Which brings us right back to that core theme of epistemic arrogance.
Because the physical invasion is just the opening act. The evidence quickly shifts from things you can see to things you can hear.
The auditory nightmare. This introduces us to Henry Akeley, a man living alone in an isolated farmhouse deep in those Vermont hills.
All by himself out there.
Yeah, and he starts actively investigating these creatures, whom he calls the Outer Ones. And his investigation leads him to capture something profoundly disturbing on a phonograph record out in the dark woods. Akeley's scientific drive completely overrides his evolutionary sense of self-preservation.
Completely.
He views himself as an observer, safely separated from his subject by the lens of academia. And because of that hubris, he stays, and he captures a ritualistic call and response that shatters that illusion of safety.
The transcript of this recording is incredibly unsettling because of the stark contrast between the speakers. First, you hear a mellow, cultivated, almost Bostonian human voice.
Just a normal guy.
Yeah, chanting, "Yeah, Shub Niggurath, the goat with 1,000 young."
We need to unpack what that chant actually means, because it is crucial to the horror. In the lore of these sources, Shub Niggurath is an ancient cosmic earth deity, a twisted fertility figure associated with mutated, uncontrolled nature.
Uncontrolled nature, right?
So the terrifying implication here isn't just that an academic Bostonian is out in the woods worshiping a dark god, it's the response he gets.
The horrifying reply. It is a buzzing insectoid drone, but it mimics English grammar perfectly.
That's the crazy part.
It is. The buzzing voice responds, "A. Shub Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young."
It is a violent manipulation of its own biology just to communicate. But the deeper psychological horror is the shared theology. Highly advanced, interstellar fungi and rural human beings are worshiping the same ancient entity.
Which proves an immemorial alliance.
Humanity hasn't just been invaded, we have been fundamentally compromised since the dawn of our species.
Maybe Akeley isn't a victim being hunted by malevolent monsters. Maybe he's just a lab rat who got a little too close to the researchers.
That is a brilliant counterpoint, and it is precisely the philosophical trap that the Outer Ones use to ensnare Akeley, because you are essentially describing the shift that takes place in his mind. Yeah, the terrifying researchers decide it is time to formally make contact with their lab rat, and they offer him a deal that appeals directly to his academic vanity.
The dark bargain. The correspondence between Akeley and our narrator, Wilmarth, takes a sudden, whiplash-inducing turn.
It's a huge pivot.
Akeley, who had been sending frantic, terrified letters about his guard dogs being slaughtered and his farmhouse being besieged, suddenly mails a neatly typed letter claiming he was entirely wrong.
Typed, which is an important detail.
Yes, very neatly typed. He says the Outer Ones, these entities from the dark, undiscovered planet Yuggoth at the rim of the solar system, are actually peaceful. They just want, in his exact words, intellectual rapport.
Intellectual rapport.
For you listening right now, this initially sounds like modern anxieties around transhumanism, Ray.
Yeah, very much so.
It's the ultimate tech bro fantasy. Upload your consciousness to the cloud, leave your fragile, aging meat sack behind, and become pure data. But this isn't a clean digital upload.
No, the science fiction of the 1920s is brutally physically invasive.
Right.
The physical mechanics of their space travel are a masterclass in body horror. The Outer Ones surgically extract the bare, compact cerebral matter of a living human being.
To scoop out the brain.
Literally, they take that physical brain and immerse it in a specialized preserving fluid inside an ether-type metal cylinder. This bizarre metal is mined exclusively on the planet Yuggoth.
So it's not even an earthly container.
Right. Then they connect the cylinder to external electrodes that can provide artificial sight, hearing, and speech.
I called it plug-and-play immortality earlier. But that makes it sound way too clean. You become a bodiless, mechanical entity carried through the freezing interstellar void on the leathery wings of these fungoid aliens.
Supposedly able to visit other planets and dimensions, sure.
Right.
Let's examine the philosophical dread of that cylinder, though. This isn't a gory death. It is the absolute, total loss of human identity and bodily autonomy.
You're just a brain in a jar.
The Outer Ones are treating human consciousness exactly like that phonograph record Akeley made in the woods. Your mind is extracted, stored in a physical container, plugged into a machine, and played on whatever adjustable instrument they deem fit.
That is horrifying.
You no longer have agency, you don't have a body, you are recorded data, you traded your physical humanity for knowledge, but as a brain in a jar, you are powerless to ever act upon that knowledge.
And Wilmarth, our narrator, reads this typed letter outlining the brain cylinders. And despite all his academic skepticism, despite knowing how insane this sounds, he actually takes the train to Vermont to visit Akeley.
A terrible, terrible decision.
This terrible decision sets up the climax of the narrative. This is where the theoretical, philosophical horror of the brain cylinders becomes a visceral, physical reality.
The scene when Wilmarth arrives at the farmhouse relies heavily on sensory overload. Wilmarth finds Akeley sitting motionless in a dark corner of his study.
Just sitting there in the dark.
Yeah, and Akeley is swathed in a heavy dressing gown, a yellow scarf is wrapped tightly around his neck, and his head and face are heavily bandaged. Akeley claims he had a severe asthma attack and can only speak in a strained, hoarse whisper.
But the visual is only half the terror. There is a strange, unplaceable alien odor in the room. Plus, a bizarre rhythmic vibration in the air.
Just an overwhelming sense of wrongness.
Right. Akeley just sits there with this cadaverous stiffness, whispering enthusiastically about the glorious cosmic journey they are going to take together. He even has the brain cylinder sitting right there on the table.
Which is so unsettling.
He connects one up, and Wilmarth literally listens to a disembodied human mind speaking through a mechanical, rattling voice box.
It pushes Wilmarth to his psychological limits. But the true breaking point, the moment the illusion shatters, comes later that night.
When he's trying to sleep.
Wilmarth is trying to sleep in the guest room upstairs, and he overhears a terrifying conversation below. He hears the unmistakable insectoid buzzing voices of the Outer Ones. He hears the mechanical scraping of the speech producer from the brain cylinder on the table, and he hears the human voice of an agent named Noise. They are conspiring together.
So Wilmarth realizes the awful truth. Akeley's supposed peace treaty was a complete fabrication. He is trapped in an isolated farmhouse with transcosmic horrors.
His worst nightmare.
Yeah, so survival instinct finally kicks in and he decides to make a break for it. He sneaks downstairs, intending to steal Akeley's Ford and escape into the night. But as he passes through that dark, foul-smelling study, he shines his flashlight on Akeley's corner chair.
And the chair is empty of any human occupant.
It's not completely empty, though.
No, it's not.
Left behind in the chair are the heavy dressing gown, the yellow scarf, and the foot bandages. And resting there amongst the discarded clothes, perfect to the last microscopic detail, are Akeley's actual face and hands.
When we break down the biological and surgical implications of this final twist, the synthesis of the horror is devastating. Akeley never made a peaceful bargain.
No, he was doomed from the start.
He was already surgically dissected before Wilmarth even arrived. Because how does a fungoid crustaceous alien convincingly wear a human face?
I don't even want to think about it.
It requires impossible, terrifying surgical precision. The entity didn't just put on a rubber mask, it flayed a living human being, kept the dermal tissue biologically intact, and stretched Akeley's actual skin over its own non-human alien framework.
The sheer revulsion of that imagery is staggering. Wilmarth realizes he had been sitting in a dark room, having a conversation with a giant alien fungus wearing his colleague's face and hands like a biological suit.
A literal skin suit.
And the absolute worst part of this entire scenario.
It gets worse.
Think about the brain cylinders sitting on the table during that conversation. Akeley's brain was almost certainly already trapped inside one of them, fully conscious, perhaps screaming silently in the dark, as this alien imposter used his own stolen skin to lure Wilmarth into the exact same trap.
It is the ultimate punishment for epistemic arrogance.
It really makes you rethink the pursuit of knowledge at all costs. We've tracked this horror from bizarre, pinkish alien corpses floating in the muddy floodwaters of Vermont to the unnatural, buzzing rituals echoing in the dark woods.
It's quite a journey.
And it all culminates in this ultimate nightmare of having your brain surgically harvested for cosmic knowledge while a monster wears your face to trick your friends.
If knowing the ultimate secrets of the cosmos requires you to become a powerless, disembodied intellect trapped in a metal jar, is the knowledge actually worth it? Does absolute truth have any value if you lose the humanity required to experience it?
It is a phenomenal cautionary tale. There is one final, truly chilling implication buried in the text that we need to address. Something for you to ponder long after this audio stops.
These brain cylinders are incredibly adaptable. The outer ones don't just keep them on Earth.
No, they take them on trips.
They carry them across the interstellar void to every planet covered by their civilization.
Right, and on those other planets, they don't just have standard audiovisual machines that replicate human sight and hearing. The notes mention that they plug these human brain cylinders into alien adjustable faculty instruments.
Which is a terrifying phrase.
So just visualize that reality for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine your human brain extracted, sealed in metal, and transported to the dark, freezing world of Yuggoth.
Millions of miles away.
And instead of being plugged into a machine that lets you see and hear normally, the outer ones plug you into a machine that forces you to experience the universe through entirely alien senses.
You are being forced to process sensory inputs that the human brain never evolved to comprehend. The physics of it would break your mind.
You would be bombarded with colors that do not exist on the earthly spectrum, sounds that defy the laws of physics, and geometric dimensions of reality that completely shatter human sanity. You are trapped in a metal cylinder, perceiving a transcosmic nightmare of angles and biological entities that you cannot understand. And the most terrifying part of all,
What's that?
as a disembodied brain wired directly into this alien sensory feed, you don't even have eyelids to shut the horror out.